So we're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone who's joining us. I'm excited that you are here. So I'm Dr. Leah Cox from the Office of Inclusion and Institutional Equity, and I'm the Vice President. So thank you for taking the time to join us today. The Office of Inclusion and Institutional Equity is committed to supporting the President's priorities of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we're committed to creating an environment where everyone feels like they belong at Towson University. So back in 2018, 2019, it appeared that all over the country there were reports of racial incidents on university campuses. And while Towson did not experience some of these same incidents, we did hear from some of our students that they did not always feel welcome on our campus. And while we decided that this is an important thing to focus on, we decided that it was also important to do a survey to get a sense of what our students were feeling on our campus. And while this survey took place in 2019, the data that we received is still very, very important and relevant in light of all of the racial inequities that are happening across our country. So we know that the perspectives and feelings of our students matter. So we need to know how our students feel so that we can begin to make some changes. We decided it's always important to collect as much data as possible so that we can make informed decisions about how we want to make and create change on our campus. We decided to utilize the National Assessment of Collegiate Campus Climate that was developed by the University of Southern California. Through their Race and Equity Center. There were multiple institutions across the country that also use this data. So we also have some data that looks at Towson in comparison to other institutions. We had hopes that the survey would elicit some perspectives from our undergraduates on ways that they experience their campus and the racial climate on our campus. So having this data will allow the institution to better understand how to strategically address racial issues on the campus with some recommendations for actions. And we have used those in our newly formed diversity strategic plan. So this morning, we're gonna take some time to, one, talk about the survey and how it was administered and the content areas of the survey. Two, the results of the survey and some deeper dives that were done and analyzed by our researcher. Three, next steps, and then four, we're going to take some questions. So let me introduce to you my colleagues who will be sharing with us information and analysis. So first, Brian Hara is the Coordinator for Training and Education in the Office of Inclusion and Institutional Equity. And two, we have Jacob Lay, Research Associate for the Regional Economic Studies Institute. So Brian, I'm going to let you go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Jacob will be sharing a slide. So you'll hear from me, from Jacob, and then we'll be back with Dr. Cox at the end for questions. So first up, to tell you a little bit more around the administration. One of the reasons why it was helpful to connect with the NACCC survey at USC is when an institution participated, they actually benefited from the logistic support from USC and their Race and Equity Center. So for example, they would support reminder emails. They would support whether an institution chose to use incentives to collect student data. So basically a lot of the administrative support that any unit or university would shoulder themselves, that was part of the agreement when you participated in the NACCC with USC. We agreed on a timetable for when was the best time on our campus to administer the survey. So there was a 5-week period in the spring of 19 where all undergraduate students, so we want to be clear, the NACCC as it was originally designed was for undergraduate populations, received an initial welcome email. And then throughout the entire 5-week period, there would be a weekly reminder for students who had not yet completed it. And even for those students who had started it but not finished it, they would get a timely reminder to complete the entire survey. So the logistical support was such a huge plus for us, and it helped result in a 22% response rate. Now, for those that know about larger higher ed surveys, for example, the NACCC. For a school of our size in 2019, the average response rate was 20%. So we were more than pleased with our response rate. The next slide unpacks in the NAC, even though it's a racial climate survey, built into the assessment instrument questions were a variety of deep demographic questions. So the ones listed were already built in for any institution, except for, you'll see transfer status, we have an asterisk. That was a request by Towson University, and they were more than willing to adapt the demographic questions. We wanted to do as much of a deep dive across student diversity categories, even within the context of a racial climate survey. So we were pleased that they were willing to add that question. And then on the next slide, it unpacks, and you'll hear a lot about the 6 content areas. If you haven't yet, we invite you to download all the documents on the companion website, and we'll share that URL again at the last slide, both in the results data and in the recommendations that we will talk about after the data and results section today. The 6 areas the NAC is designed to focus on. First, mattering and affirmation. Next, cross-racial engagements. This idea of students working across racial groups and racial populations. Next, racial learning and literacy. Just one undergraduate's own learning over their time in undergraduate studies. Encounters with racial stress. That I think speaks for itself. And even though this was administered in 2019, I think a lot of us are really interested in ways of monitoring that, particularly with current events. And then the last 2 speak to students' own perceptions of the institution's commitment to improving the racial climate. And then the last category also is a nod to what's happening outside the boundaries of our campus. And given the Towson community, sometimes the borders aren't as clear-cut for many of us. So we appreciate the 6 different areas, and you'll see that come back in our recommendation section. I'm going to pass it over to Jacob for some of the deep dive with the results of the data.
Thank you, Brian. So for this survey, if you look on the website on the page on which the Office of Inclusion has posted a number of documents, you can see the results that were sent to us from the USC Race and Equity Center. And they break down every question on the survey by the responses of white students versus the responses of students of color, which is an aggregated group of essentially all non-white students. It also marks where each result is statistically significant with both an asterisk and colored highlighting to make it very clear. So today I'm not really going through and reiterating the results there. Those are available to look through and view. Instead, the goals for RESI and for myself were to try to examine demographic variables beyond just race and ethnicity. As Brian talked about on the previous slide, there were quite a few demographic categories other than race and ethnicity on the survey, and the report from USC doesn't really go into any of those, so the question was to look at those in a little more depth. Also, hoping to try to break down the aggregated students of color group into more specific individual racial categories. There are valid reasons to aggregate students together into a single group for statistical analysis, especially since USC has a focus with the NAC survey on comparing institutions. But for our purposes, looking at how we're doing here at Towson University, we wanted to try to break that down into separate groups. And then also just to try to look at other ways of viewing the data that are outside what USC did in their official report. So to start off, we wanted to try to look at the demographics outside of just race and ethnicity. The main issue that we encountered trying to do that is that most of the survey questions are really heavily focused on racial issues. So, and we will get to some of these questions later in this presentation, but there are questions like what racially related issues are you seeing discussed on campus? How comfortable are you discussing these issues with different racial groups? Do you have experience with racism on campus? You know, how do you feel in classrooms that are run by white professors versus classrooms that are run by professors of color? And these are all very good questions, but they don't necessarily give as much meaningful result when you're looking at some of the demographic categories that are outside of race and ethnicity. And so what we chose to do was look at one particular set of questions, which was much more broad, about how do you feel at Towson University? Specifically, how it was worded to say, how safe do you feel at Towson? How welcome do you feel? And how included do you feel? These were on 7-point scales, higher numbers being more positive responses. And we were able to use these to look at the various responses for many different demographic categories. And so we're going to walk through a few of different ones and see the kind of responses that we got and what kind of results we're looking at. To start, we have gender. You can see here the responses are not terribly different for women and men at Towson University. However, we did have, it should be noted, we had a very strong response rate. It was 22%, as Brian mentioned earlier, which meant we had a few thousand respondents. So even small differences are statistically significant. In this case, the 0.2 of a point that you see between women and men in feeling safe at Towson University is statistically significant. Women feel a little bit less safe. Meanwhile, the differences that you see for feeling welcome and included are not statistically significant. Statistically, those are the same response. It is notable that it is statistically significant, even if it is only 0.2 of a point. You can note that the way that I have this visualized here, it almost seems to minimize the difference. Essentially, I've choose to leave this scale at 7 rather than, you can visualize these things by changing the scale and make it more obvious. But I'd like to show that it is a statistically significant difference, and it is very arguable that any statistically significant difference is something that needs to be addressed. But ultimately, it's up to the administration and to the community on what kind of differences we're willing to tolerate and what kind of differences are something that we need to address. So that's not necessarily something that I can provide an answer to, but it is notable that you have a statistically significant difference on feelings of safety. We did also try to include respondents who did not state that they were either women or men in a binary context. There were a number of other responses that you could give to the gender question, including gender nonconforming, transgender man, transgender woman, non-binary, and you could also choose to specify an identity that was not listed. In this case, all of those individual categories, the sample was not large enough to look at them individually, but we were able to aggregate those into an all other group. And you can see here that there is a much larger and very statistically significant difference between the responses of feeling safe, welcome, and included for individuals who did not select one of the gender binary categories. It is much lower than either women or men, and it is statistically significant. And the difference from both the responses of women, of men, and of women and men combined. Another category we have is, are you a member of a Greek organization, a fraternity or a sorority? In this case, membership in a fraternity or a sorority is associated with positive feelings of both welcome and inclusion. Feelings of safety are essentially the same regardless of whether you're part of a Greek organization, but for welcome and inclusion, there is a stronger feeling if you are part of those organizations, which tracks with the idea that you're living with and hanging out with a group of people that you've chosen to live with, which you would expect to give you stronger feelings of welcome and inclusion. We also tried to look at sexual orientation, and so in this case, you see the experiences of straight or heterosexual students versus LGBTQA+. Transgender is excluded from this category simply because it was part of the gender question, and it was included in the previous slide on gender. You can see here there is a statistically significant difference in all three categories, where LGBTQA+ students feel on average less safe, less welcome, and less included than straight or heterosexual students. Again, looking at these, it is important to reiterate that this is on a 7-point scale, across the board, and we'll be seeing this for almost all of the responses in the survey. Responses are overall positive. All students are responding that they feel relatively safe, welcome, and included. but there still are significant differences between groups. Another way to look at the demographic data that we tried to do to a degree is to try to combine demographic categories. So this was something I was asked about specifically, was how can we look at, for example, LGBTQA students within the group of students of color. So can you combine demographics and look at, subcategories? So in this case, you can see the blue bars are LGBTQI plus students of color. The orange bars are straight students of color. Only students of color are represented in this particular chart. And you can see that the patterns are relatively similar between this chart and the previous chart for all LGBTQI plus students. The main differences being that the gaps between the two groups are a little larger, and also that the responses overall are a little bit lower because students of color tend to have on average, lower responses to some of these questions. And so while the pattern is the same, their responses are a little bit lower. And that's what we saw for most questions that I analyzed for LGBTQI plus students of color, that the fault lines are generally the same as you would see for LGBTQI plus students as a whole at Towson University. But you generally will see on average the level of the response is a little bit lower simply because you're combining two minority groups together. The last non-racial demographic group that we looked at was religious groups on campus. There are a number of different religious groups that have pretty robust representation, both on campus and in the survey. There were a number of different statistically significant results that I have listed here. Specifically, Jewish students reported feeling more included than non-Jewish students. Muslim students reported feeling less safe than non-Muslim students. Catholic students reported feeling more welcome and included than non-Catholic students, while Christian non-Catholic students reported the opposite, feeling less welcome and included. This is something that was statistically significant, but I would warn against maybe looking too much into it. This is, when we dive into the data a little deeper, what we can see is that religion on campus is pretty highly correlated with race. Ultimately, Jewish students are generally much more white than the campus as a whole. Muslim students are much more non-white than the campus as a whole, and we see the same for Catholic students are more white, and Christian non-Catholic students are more non-white. And so these differences track pretty closely with differences that we see between students of color and white students. And so it's not to say for certain that religion doesn't have anything to do with it, but it is a case where it's much more appears to be much more of a matter of being correlated with race than it is necessarily a specific issue with religion. And speaking of race, this is the question for racial categories. So breaking down the group of students of color into various groups. One of the benefits of aggregating students of color together into a single group is that you are able to include everyone. One of the drawbacks to splitting them, although you are able to look at individual groups, is that you can't necessarily look at every single student because certain groups are too small for statistical analysis. However, we were able to look at Hispanic students, Asian students, and Black students, which are the three largest non-white racial groups on campus, and we have them here compared with white or Caucasian students. And what you can see when you split these out is that it's a little bit different for every category. For safe, for welcome, for included. If you were to just look at the results as white students versus students of color, you would see a pretty similar chart for each. You would see white students with a more positive response than students of color for all three of these. And the only real difference would be maybe a little bit the size of the gap and also, exactly where on the 7-point scale they fall. But when you break these into groups, you can see that actually individual racial groups on campus have different experiences. When you look at how safe do you feel, it's actually the case that Hispanic students feel on average equally safe with white students, and then Asian and Black students feel a little bit less safe. When you look at feelings of welcome, it's clear that students of color as a whole do appear to have a pretty similar experience. They're all about the same level, a little bit below the feeling of welcome seen by white students. And when you look at feeling included, there is almost 3 different tiers underneath the white students, where you have white students feeling the most included, and then black students feeling a bit less included, and then Asian and then Hispanic on these small little steps down. And so these, when you combine to students of color, you lose some of that distinction, which is something to consider when looking through the greater NAC results provided by USC. One interesting thing we were able to look at was the responses to a very similar, almost identical question that was asked, which is how safe do you feel, not at Towson University, but how safe do you feel in the surrounding city/town, which is how it was worded in the survey. It should be noted that given that it said surrounding city/town, I would imagine most respondents would probably interpret that at Towson as, you know, the Towson city. But given the particular geography of where we are, it's also possible to interpret that as Baltimore, and it's hard to know exactly how each student chose to interpret that question. You can see that for students as a whole, generally they feel much less safe off campus than on campus. They feel less welcome and less included as well. What's particularly interesting is to look at this by racial group. So you can see the blue bars here are how safe do you feel at TU, and these match the data that we saw 2 slides previously. But when you compare this to how each group feels in the surrounding city-town, you can see that the situation gets flipped a little bit. It is a universal experience, no matter who you are, that you tend to feel a lot less safe outside of TU than you do on TU when you're off campus. But exactly how safe you feel relative to other groups has switched. So while previously at Towson University, Black or African Americans report on average the lowest feeling of safety, when you're off campus in the surrounding city or town, Black or African American students report the highest feelings of safety. Essentially, the drop off for white, Hispanic, and for Asian students is much larger than the drop off that we see for Black students. And it's interesting to see this just because one way that you could try to dismiss the results from the previous slide is just to try to argue that, you know, we're in the United States, being Black in America is almost an inherently unsafe experience compared to, for example, being a white student in America. But you can see that it's not necessarily the case in all situations that a Black student is going to feel less safe than a white student. There is something about being at Towson University. It's not necessarily a matter of causation, but there is something correlated with being at Towson University that has Black students feeling less safe on average than white students while on campus. You know, again, everyone feels much more safe on campus than off campus, but it's not inherently the case that students of color and Black students in particular are going to feel less safe in all situations. It's something that's occurring at Towson University that's not occurring off campus. So we already discussed the issues with this a little bit with aggregating non-white students, particularly the issue that when you aggregate non-white students into a single category of students of color, you lose some of the distinction, you lose some of the individual experience that students have as a result, or that is correlated with their individual racial group. And we saw that a little bit splitting out the details about how they feel on campus, but also to illustrate that with a little more detail, we looked at questions about the microaggressions that students experience at Towson University. So one of the there were many questions. It was a series of, you know, microaggressions, all of the general things you might expect. And essentially all students were asked how often they're experiencing these, or have you experienced these in the past year or so. So one of these was the idea of being viewed as a foreigner, even when you're not. You can see that students of color experience this at, I believe, about a 13% rate, while white students experience this at a much smaller 2% rate. And if you were to look at any individual microaggression on the survey, you're going to see roughly this shape of chart. You know, the exact numbers may be different, but you're going to see students of color experience it at a much higher rate than white students. But if you were to break this down into the individual racial categories, you can see that the experience is really not universal. Students of color are, you know, not having all of the same experience no matter who they are. In this case, for this particular issue, Asian students are experiencing it at a much higher rate than Hispanic students, who are experiencing it at a much higher rate than Black students, who are experiencing it at a much higher rate than white students. Each of these individual racial groups is having a distinct experience that is lost when you just look at students of color. And so that's something to consider when looking through the larger NAC report. Although there are a lot of statistically significant findings in there, that it does not necessarily tell you who is having this experience more than others. One other one that we looked at is assumed to be an athlete when you are not. Again, this chart looks very similar to the one we saw for the previous microaggression. You have 9% versus 3%. The numbers are a little bit different, but the shape is roughly the same. However, when you break this down, it looks much different than the previous microaggression. In this case, students who say they were assumed to be an athlete when they are not are almost all Black or African American students. At what I believe the percentage here is hidden behind my about 14%, as opposed to 3% for Asian or Asian American students, for white or Caucasian students, and 1% for Hispanic students. And so what's happening here is that the experience of Black or African American students is almost being diluted in a way by the experience of everyone else, because their experience is being aggregated with students who aren't experiencing it all. So really, the students who experience this are experiencing it at a 14% rate, and not a 9% rate. And it really is only the one racial group. And so you lose, a lot of that detail, a lot of the useful information when you aggregate together. So one of the last things we were able to do is try to compare the responses of different questions together. This is one more thing that was not really done by the NAC report itself. We already went over some of this a little bit earlier when we compared how you feel at Towson University versus off campus, but there are some other ways to apply this. One set of questions in the mattering and affirmation section of the survey asked, do you feel like you matter in classrooms taught by white or Caucasian professors, and do you feel like you matter in classrooms taught by professors of color? Now, in this case, this is on a 5-point scale where 5 points, an answer of 5 states that they feel they strongly matter, and an answer of 1 states that they feel they don't matter at all. And what you can see here is that white students feel like they matter equally no matter who's teaching the course. The responses are effectively exactly the same on average, while Asian students, Hispanic students, and Black students all feel like they matter more when a class is being taught by a professor of color. And those 3 groups are having different experiences themselves, where Black students have a much larger effect in this category than Hispanic or Asian students. And again, we can look at this for events run by majority white or Caucasian fraternities and sororities versus majority color fraternities and sororities. In this case, we see something very similar to what we saw in the previous slide, where Black students, Hispanic students, and Asian students are all stating that they feel like they matter much more in events that are being run by majority students of color Greek organizations. In this case, white students actually do have a statistically significant difference, although it is reversed from the experience of everyone else, in the sense that they feel like they matter more in events run by majority white or Caucasian fraternities and sororities. One reason that we've sort of postulated on why you have a difference for white students in this question, but you do not have a difference for white students on the previous question about classrooms, is that we have a strong minority presence here at Towson University, but it is still a majority white school. And so in a classroom that is taught by a professor of color, it is still likely the case that the white students are still the majority in that classroom. And so, it's still a majority white classroom. They still feel like they matter. While if you have white students going to an event run specifically by a fraternity or a sorority that is majority students of color, they may actually be the minority in that situation. And so you start seeing the effect that you see for every other racial group when they are the minority in a situation. So one final point to make is that demographics don't necessarily explain all of the variance that we see. This is a demographic forward survey. It is focused on demographics, on race and ethnicity in particular, but also with all of the other demographic categories that we captured. We did see how in many cases the differences are statistically significant, but they aren't necessarily that large in real terms. We did run regressions for many of these demographic categories, meaning that we tossed many of the demographic categories that we were looking at that we found individual statistical significance for into a single regression to see how much, both how each of those individual categories square up against the others as far as statistical significance, but also to see how much they explain the story as a whole. And generally, what we found is an R-squared value that is very low. The R-squared value in a regression is meant to tell you how much do all of the variables that you're looking at explain the story. And generally, the values were very low when we looked at this, which suggests that the demographic variables do not explain the majority of the variation in responses. Essentially, there are likely non-demographic factors that can't necessarily be captured by this survey, that are not captured by this survey, that are affecting, how do people feel at Towson University? How much do they feel they matter? That fuel the responses to many of these questions. And so the demographic variables are important and they are statistically significant, and it is something that is worth addressing at Towson, but it's also important to note that you cannot necessarily predict someone's response just based on their demographic information. There are other factors at play. And yeah, that is the end of my the analysis. We have a version of a lot of these results written up in a supplemental analysis document, which is been posted online along with the results sent to us by USC.
Thank you, Jacob. And we do want to just stop to really appreciate Jacob and the team at RESI. So as many of you know, RESI is part of the Division of Strategic Partnerships and Applied Research. And to be clear, when we took part in the NAC in the spring of 19, it wasn't until mid-fall we received back the results and the de-identified data. So it's such a credit to the researchers in RESI that even though, as we said earlier, even though the NAC is designed as a racial climate survey, remember the 6 content areas. The first content area of mattering and affirmation, and as you'll see in the results document, you see every question in each section. The questions around mattering and affirmation lended themselves the most to do a deeper dive on all the demographic data. So we really appreciate Jacob and the team in RESI, because even though it's a racial climate survey, we were able to glean additional insight into the mattering content areas in particular. And it took, then the RESI team went through a couple of different iterations. They let us know what they found. We asked for more, sort of as deep a dive as we could on demographics. So we really appreciate that. The results document itself is one of the documents on the OIE website. The one thing we did do in the results document is the results indicated with a small asterisk anywhere there was a significant difference. We also went ahead and color coded that to the color coding of the content areas. We were trying to make it as easy as possible to see anywhere there was a significant difference. And then the report that Jacob mentioned, the additional deep dive on data that his team did, is the separate document uploaded, as well as the list of recommendations. So based on the results for TU undergraduate students, NAC also included a tangible list, again, broken down by each content area, of tangible recommendations to move forward to improve the racial climate. And then what we did alongside with that is we identified across TU the responsible units to begin navigating and exploring how to implement each of the recommendations. So that document is also uploadable or downloadable on the website, and we appreciate anyone taking time to review that. And then the next slide, Jacob, please. As Dr. Cox mentioned, the NAC happened at an interesting time as we were beginning to work on developing the university's 5-year diversity strategic plan. So the NAC results are going to be able to fold into the soon-to-be released strategic plan. So we invite the campus to begin reviewing the NAC recommendations as we wait for the release of the strategic plan. And we hope that we'll be able to find ways to integrate them together and to do a coordinated effort. And the NAC was, by design, a climate study focusing on undergraduate students. We're trying to also, as part of the strategic plan process, identify a realistic schedule to conduct climate studies for all parts of the campus as often as we can. And that will be explored further as the plan is released. And then the next slide is where we want to make time to address some questions, some comments, and we welcome feedback in the chat box and in the Q&A box.
All right. Hi. So a question that just came in was there any questions related to socioeconomic status or household income?
Sure, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment so that I can actually look into the data here. I do believe there was some degree of question for that. I can actually jump into the code book really quick and answer that for certain since I'm on my laptop. There is a question. There was a question about have you received a federal Pell Grant? I think that's primarily the only question that would specifically get on socioeconomic status. There are some others that could hint at it. Have any of your parents or guardians been to college beyond high school? Other ones about education by your parents that could probably correlate pretty strongly with socioeconomic status. But those are primarily the questions. There wasn't anything of asking specifically about household income or anything that would kind of get granular, in the thousands of dollars or anything like that.
Thank you, Jacob. Do we have an anticipated time frame for the strategic plan to be released?
Yes, so it is finished, approved, and so we're waiting for our marketing department to get it up on the website so that it's accessible to any member of our campus. So it should be in the next week or so. You'll get an announcement to the campus and probably into you today. You'll see it go up and anyone is welcome to then review.
Another question was, on the website, the raw data and recommendations are available, but the main report from NACCC is not. Is there a reason for that?
Well, there was one additional document. So the document that's posted is the primary results that were provided by NACCC. They did provide a write-up, but it didn't really go into any of the data, as I recall. They're particularly interested in one of the things I didn't really go into in my presentation about why they decided to combine students of color into an aggregated group is because they were very interested in comparing universities to each other, using a weird kind of yellow ribbon system that didn't seem to make any sense to any of us. So we chose to focus much more on how is Towson University doing, objectively, and is that okay do we feel that that's okay, and less about how are we doing compared to other universities, because many of the difference reasons between us and other universities were relatively small, and I don't personally think that it's that meaningful to be, we're interested in how are we doing. If we're the best in a group that's not doing that well, for example, that's not necessarily acceptable to us. We want to make sure that we're doing as well as we can, less about how is everyone else doing.
And when in the spring of 19, there happened to have been 21 institutions that took part. When you take part as an institution, part of the agreement is you receive the de-identified data back, and no one else knows that. So they acknowledged 21 schools, but they told us nothing about which 21 schools. So that was the other big question mark. And we understand the need because that was the part of the agreement for each institution. So there was no additional context to what the other 21 schools in that happened to have taken it in the same semester. There was no other information about them.
Do we, excuse me, do we know what the response rates are across racial groups?
I think, Jacob, they break down the results by race, don't they?
I'm sure we could. I don't know off the top of my head. I mean, we have, the response rate, just, comparing the number of responses versus the number of students at Towson. I'm sure we could do that for individual racial groups. I don't know if we know that information off the top of my head right now. But that seems like something that could be easily calculated.
They do provide sort of percentage rates, but not raw numbers in their response in the final report that they sent to us.
Did the survey?
I'm sorry. Just as one last detail, I can tell you that from looking through the data that white students were just a bit over half, somewhere, I think between 55 and 60% of the respondents to the survey were white, which is to say that they were a majority, but also not an overwhelming majority. So we did have a very strong participation from minority groups on campus.
Did the survey collect information on participants' majors?
Good question, actually. I can answer that right now. It did, yes. It did ask, have you declared a major? And it asked, what is your major? Ultimately, looking at specific majors can be kind of tricky, just because you start looking into groups. Like, presumably you would want to be looking at majors along with demographic information, and you start getting into groups that end up being very small. It makes it difficult for statistical analysis. But the survey did capture, it asked, do you have a major? Are you a double major? If you are a double major, what are each of your majors? It tried to get that as granular as it could.
Is the data regarding the other factors, encounters with racial stress, etc., in the report online?
Every question on the survey is represented in the data set provided by USC. So the one that shows white students versus students of color and which ones are statistically significant represents every survey question that was on the survey.
Will the survey be repeated in spring 2021 in order to track any changes in students' responses with time?
That's a possibility. So we need to see that USC is still offering the survey. If they're not, then we'll certainly look at a different survey. It may be a little bit too soon in 2021, since our students have not been on campus for, we're approaching almost a year soon. So we'd like to have a climate survey where our students are definitely a part of the campus to answer some of those questions about mattering and belonging.
Then we have a question about TUPD is not included as a responsible unit on the recommended actions. How do you think the department can be included in the solutions?
That's a good question. As we look at things that are going on now, we certainly, as we take a look at some of the recommendations from the NAC and things that we're looking at in the strategic plan, we certainly plan to work with TUPD about making sure that our students feel a sense of belonging, mattering, creating a comfortable climate. So yes, it's something that we definitely need to look at and then make a part of our plan, our action plan.
Was there anything that surprised you in the data?
I'm curious what Jacob's answer is.
That's a good question. I would say the result, probably the most surprising result, I find these interesting things that I don't necessarily know what to make of them. Probably the one thing that made it into the presentation that would apply to would be where Black or African American students felt more safe than everyone else when you're talking about how safe, welcome, and included you feel off campus versus on campus. It was interesting to see, the script get flipped a little bit on that, because it does bring into question exactly why is it that Black or African American students feel less safe than white students when on campus, if when they go off campus, they'd feel more safe than white students. And I can make guesses about simply especially if you're talking about going into Baltimore, you're going from a majority white campus to a majority Black city. So there's various reasons for that, but it was interesting to see that get flipped.
Mhm.
I don't know that anything surprised me. I mean, generally the trends, I think if you are at TU and work with our students, I don't think most of the overall trends are surprising. I think if you work here, you know the climate. It left me more intrigued. I so appreciate the Jacob and his team to do the deeper dive beyond race, even though it's a racial climate study. So was I surprised? I don't think I was surprised by anything.
I think I was encouraged around the racial learning and literacy, that our faculty are providing those classes and opportunities for growth and learning in our classrooms. And I think a lot of folks don't recognize how much we're doing. So it was really encouraging to see that we're moving in the right direction.
We just had another question come in. The question is, where do we go from here? And it's specifically addressing that the survey seems to point to increased need for professors of color.
Sure. We recognize this will be a part of the strategic plan, and I know it's probably part of the larger institutional strategic plan that we need to increase the number of underrepresented faculty on our campus. And so we are working, my office, in conjunction with the provost's office and HR and everyone else on campus to sort of make that happen. It is a priority of the president's, who's going to be trying to lay out a plan as to what we do next and how we move forward with increasing that.
We have another question that seems to be related. From my, so it says, from the interpretations of the data, it seems like the effect of having a Black professor was the most statistically significant. Is that correct?
I will say, we tried to look at the individual racial groups for respondents on campus. Some of the questions couldn't necessarily be teased out. So the question is phrased as, professors of color versus white professors. It's hard to tease out specifically. You can certainly make assumptions about what it might be intending, but it's hard to say specifically the effect. For the chart that you're thinking of, I think where you have the most effect being for Black as opposed to white or Hispanic or Asian, the race in that chart is for the student respondent, not the color of the professor. So Black students are stating that they have the largest difference between classrooms taught by white professors versus professors of color. We can't, it's not unreasonable to assume that in that case they're thinking of having a classroom with a Black professor. We can't say with 100% certainty based on the wording of the question. But
when can we expect an update regarding this meeting and action steps?
So once the strategic plan is released, which I said is in another couple of weeks, we'll be calling back to gather our task force to talk about next steps, where we're going. And then every year, probably maybe once a semester, we'll sort of call together a town hall again like this to release some of the things that have been done, some of the things that we know need to be changed, updated. So we'll be giving you regular updates. There'll certainly be regular updates on the OIIE website as we continue to move forward.
What other statistical measures or standards will drive your office's work?
So we take a look at everything. We look at all of the NACCC data, and the student incoming data. We're collecting and continuing. We will do some town halls when we're all back on campus and are able to safely meet. We'll continue to do those focus groups. So we're collecting as much data as we can. As Brian talked about, we're going to be looking at doing surveys, climate surveys for our faculty and staff to see where we are. But again, since we're not on campus, we want to make sure that we have an accurate view of the climate on campus once we return. So we'll be gearing up for those surveys, hopefully as soon as we can return.
So this one is more of a statement, but I think it can be made into a question. On the question referring to surrounding city and town, do we know if some students may have been thinking of Towson and others were thinking of Baltimore? Like how?
That's a very good question. I kind of tried to make that point while I was speaking. Is we don't know for certain. I think this survey is designed to be applied to a number of different universities, and I think in a lot of universities that's not really a question. Like if you're doing this to Penn State, like you're in a college town, like it doesn't really make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
For Towson University, we're in a little bit of a weird spot where we are in, Towson University is obviously in Towson, but Towson is kind of part of the greater Baltimore area. And if you're talking about the surrounding city, people may be thinking of Baltimore. It was definitely a thought that we had that some students may be thinking of Towson and some students may be thinking of Baltimore, but we don't have any way of knowing how each student was interpreting that question when they chose to answer it.
And we did have a comment earlier about the idea of relative safety for non-straight students being 4.7 out of 7. I'm wondering if we can define what relatively safe means.
It's tricky. I mean, I'm trying to make a point as I go through that a lot of the responses aren't terribly low, but as you can see with some groups, it is significantly lower than others. Personally, I can't really make a judgment call on what is an acceptable level of feeling safe at Towson. That's the results are the results. I would agree that 4.7 is certainly low compared to some of the groups that were giving like a 6 out of 7. I can't really make the judgment call on what we consider to be relatively safe or not. Some of the language when I'm nervously speaking might be imprecise when I'm presenting, but yeah, I don't know if I would call that relatively safe or not. That's a tricky question.
What do you know for sure about race-based experiences on TU's campus after this survey? What areas are you dedicated to move on campus?
So it's clear that our students wanted to feel more engaged in the classroom around these conversations, and we are certainly doing our best to focus on how to help our faculty and staff engage in dialogue in the classroom so that students don't feel that burden. We recognize that there's a need for more of a feeling of belonging, and so we're definitely working across the campus to make that happen. And it also becomes clear, while students may not always feel comfortable having these conversations, it becomes clear that our faculty aren't always comfortable leading these conversations. And so through the provost's office and my office, we've been working with departments and colleges on these issues around race, anti-racism, social justice, and how to have these conversations. Our dialogues, IGD, work has ramped up tremendously in the last, I'd say, 7 months, where Brian Hara and Dr. Shauna Payne-Gold have been working tirelessly to do trainings across the campus in terms of how to have these conversations, how to guide these through our classes. So we know that we need to make that happen. We know that we need to have more faculty of color in the classroom. It's not only our students of color who feel comfortable, but it's also making sure that our white students are exposed to different cultures, different people, which they're going to leave here. They're going to leave Towson and be a part of a larger global community, and they need to understand that diversity matters, inclusivity matters, equity matters, and how we apply that in everything we do at Towson and outside of Towson. So we know we have work to do. We're gonna do what we can.
And I think this last question is related to this. Who is developing the tangible and specific changes that will occur in the classroom and on curriculum level? And this specifically addresses English majors who are required to take 4 classes on British literature and Shakespeare, and this continues to center white cis men's experiences. So what does this mean for how the English canon is recognized and taught in the classroom?
So I'm going to let Brian talk a little bit about some of the inclusive classroom work that he's been doing.
Yeah, so OIE is partnering with the Provost Office and developing a larger certification series of modules and trainings for faculty. So I think the question needs to be complex because I think each department needs to have their own discussions around their curriculum and when it's ready to have a critical analysis. And there's also, as Dr. Huck mentioned, teaching. So the content is one thing, the approaches, the pedagogies are another. So we continue to partner with the Provost Office to support each unit in different ways. Our approach cannot be to deliver this exact same lessons or strategies to every department. We try to always personalize that and have conversations. So any particular department, we would hope that they regularly, through their committee structure, are reviewing curriculum, are regularly getting student feedback, and it's sort of it needs to be more complex step-by-step process. Wherever the department is at is where we want to engage and support them. But we at least are lining up some consistent support across the campus. And if any department hasn't yet reached out, please do. And we're happy to meet and to help you begin strategize.
Okay. As of right now, we have no other questions waiting to be answered.
And that gives us time. Jacob, you can share the last slide. We want to make sure that everyone knows that the documents are available and they will stay available. We encourage you to review, sit with the data and the results. We encourage you to begin to review the action items. We also encourage you to weigh carefully. I think if you hold both the NAC recommendations and then once we all have the diversity strategic plan, I think we'd like to have a conversation about all of them as one package. Part of our plan with the strategic plan, as Dr. Cox mentioned, not only will we bring back the task force, this is a university-wide task force that has worked for the last, I think, 14, 15 months. We will bring them back together on a regular basis, but we also are envisioning having a very similar town hall like this once the plan is out and people have had a chance to review it. We welcome feedback. So in terms of the NAC results, as well as the soon-to-be released strategic plan, they all exist on the same website for the strategic plan. And we are using, as we have for the past year, through the data collection and focus groups, we point everyone to the inclusion@towson.edu email. You'll see that linked also on the website. There's a separate link to an online form, which is very similar to the email. So we welcome your ongoing feedback as you have time to sit with the data on NAC and the recommendations. Even if you're in a unit that was named as responsible, please reach out to us when you're ready to talk around how to begin to plan to have a lead role in working towards any of those action items.
I want to thank everybody for joining us this morning. It was great to see the number of participants who are interested in this data, and please feel free to email us at any time. We're happy to talk about some of these things, hear some of your suggestions, or interest in participating to help move some of these initiatives forward. So again, thank you. Thank you, Jacob. Great job. Mercedes, thank you so much for handling all of the questions and tech in the background. And Brian, thank you so much. Everyone have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.